Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. So in December, Georgia Horton, a resident of Compton in Los Angeles County, found herself on the verge of homelessness. This would have been devastating for Ms. Horton, who spent the previous 5 years working to get back on her feet after spending 25 years before that in prison. So it wasn't too long ago that things were looking pretty good for Ms. Horton. She had found success working as a motivational speaker and an evangelist at a community church. She wrote a book. But then the pandemic hit, destabilizing her life as it has so many Americans. Her work dried up. She couldn't find enough odd jobs to make ends meet. Ms. Horton fell behind on rent, and with no way to keep up with the mounting bills, she knew it would only be a matter of time before she'd be evicted and out on the street. But then a lifeline came in the form of an invitation to join something called the Compton Pledge, which the Los Angeles Times described as among the largest and most ambitious guaranteed income experiments in the US to date. The concept of the Compton Pledge is simple. Give money to people with no strings attached. By the end of March, Ms. Horton will be among the 800 Compton residents enrolled who for the next 2 years will begin receiving monthly payments of between $300 and $600 deposited on a prepaid debit card or through Venmo or PayPal or direct deposit, whatever works best. So support for this universal basic income approach has been driven by data showing that far too many people are falling through holes in the social safety net. Many of the existing programs rely on extensive means testing that limits who can receive benefits and cuts off people who need help and forms significant bureaucratic barriers. Ms. Horton, for example, would have a hard time qualifying for a lot of programs because of her felony record, but that may be the very thing that makes her more in need of a little extra help stabilizing. These direct cash payment programs operate under the basic idea that if you give money to people who need it, they will spend it on necessities, and in better times, maybe even use it to begin building their savings or a little nest egg for a rainy day. So that certainly appears to be the case for Ms. Horton. She told the LA Times that this supplemental income made her able to breathe again. She said it would help her get back on track and start thinking not just what to do during the pandemic, but beyond, which I think we can all agree is what we're kind of hoping for all of our families and neighbors and communities during this unprecedented time. So the Compton Pledge is one of nearly a dozen such programs that will provide direct cash payments to residents by the end of the year. The pledge is being funded by donors, meaning taxpayers are not supplementing it at present, and it's managed by the Fund for Guaranteed Income. So Compton Mayor Asia Brown has been one of the most vocal proponents of the program, which she's described as a way to combat entrenched economic and racial inequality that has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And she is joining me now to talk more about the Compton Pledge and other direct cash payment programs. And I'm also joined by Nika Soon-Shiong, the co-director of the Compton Pledge and executive director of the Fund for Guaranteed Income. Thank you both so much for joining us on The Appeal Live today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, Emily.
I've been saying it's going to be a good show. I'm really excited to talk with you all. I have so many questions. I'm going to start with you, Mayor Brown. And I'd love for you to start by explaining how you got involved in this and how it went from an idea to a reality in your city.
Well, thankfully, I've been following Mayor Michael Tubbs of Stockton and the work that they did with their pilot for guaranteed income a couple of years ago. And when he decided to start the Mayors for Guaranteed Income initiative, I joined him as one of the founding mayors and made a commitment and a pledge to implement a guaranteed income pilot in my community of Compton. And shortly after launching, I was contacted by the Fund for Guaranteed Income and the Jane Family Institute to just learn more about my vision for our pilot in Compton and to figure out if we could align in implementing our pilot together. And we did, and the rest is history. We were able to really think about how our pilot could also obviously impact Compton residents, but also add to the greater policy work of making the case for guaranteed income around the nation.
So how do people get into the Compton Pledge? What's the selection process like?
The selection process is randomized. People do not apply. We actually have a pre-vetted list of low-income residents that meet our thresholds for percentages below the poverty line. And so they were randomly selected by our research partner to be a part of our program.
So Nika, what got you and the Fund for Guaranteed Income involved in this work in Compton?
Sure, thank you so much. The Fund for Guaranteed Income is something that I've really been building in my academic and professional experience for years, but it was officially launched this summer when it felt like the Overton window for guaranteed income that really challenges the entrenched inequalities in the welfare system was blown open. And I also knew Mayor Michael Tubbs from college and have been talking with him about this idea for a number of years. And when I met Mayor Brown, as she states, the rest is history.
Focus on this, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more, just broadly, like what are the arguments for guaranteed income? What are the benefits of guaranteed income over other social safety net programs? And also, if you could add, why no means testing? Why is it important to provide this without sort of the usual bureaucracy associated with such programs? That's for Nika.
Well, hyper-targeted and means-tested programs feed into this frenzy of how to identify the deserving poor, how to weed out criminal and fraudulent people who are on welfare rolls, for example. And that narrative allows the nation to ethically distance itself from the reality of massive wealth inequality. And so guaranteed income and the ethos behind it is really that people deserve to have the breathing room to survive this pandemic and to have an income floor. And I think that it's a moral stance and a political stance as much as it is a social policy and an economic policy.
So Mayor Brown, the Compton Pledge is launching as residents in your city and all across the country are continuing to struggle. And what I mentioned at the top has been an unprecedented crisis. It's a deadly pandemic. It's the worst economic recession in a generation. I'm wondering if you could tell us some stories from your jurisdiction about how COVID-19 has highlighted the urgency of a guaranteed income.
Absolutely. Compton, like many other communities of color, were hard hit by COVID-19 and the systemic injustices from economically to access to healthcare, access to testing, and otherwise were just really illuminated in just a really powerful way. And seeing residents trying to grapple with how they're able to maintain a shelter, how are they able to educate their children and maintain employment, or if they were not employed, how are they able to just stabilize their families and households. And one thing that I've learned just personally growing up with a single mother that worked through poverty on a regular basis, I recognized that she was just always, and my family was just always in a pressure cooker. And so when we talk about the necessity for people to have breathing room, I really thought of all the families that were just really hard hit through this pandemic and had just illuminated the need to have a direct intervention. We've seen the CARES Act and how people were waiting for stimulus checks. And there's just so many gaps in the government's ability and just really the urgency in meeting the direct needs of people. And so in Compton, it was no different. People were without direct assistance. There are many people who do not qualify for government aid, like those that were formerly incarcerated or the undocumented community. Compton is heavily Latino, where almost 70% and 30% African American. And so there is a large percentage of our population that is undocumented. So I thought about all the families that are without aid, without assistance, that are facing homelessness, that are already in poverty, and that are combating the widening of poverty. And we've seen the indicators economically with the wealth gap widening. During this pandemic, there was just a direct need for intervention. And I think that we cannot, as a nation, consider ourselves one of the most powerful in the world and not consider poverty a human rights issue. And we literally have people that are not only strapped economically, but mentally and physically by the impacts of poverty. And it's something that guaranteed income has the direct ability to have an immediate impact.
I'm so glad you brought up the sort of mental and emotional component. I think it's something that we mentioned at the top, the feeling of being able to breathe, of taking a little bit of stress out of the pressure cooker. And I would be interesting to think, I'm going to turn back to Nika in a second to talk about data, but I would be interested to hear more about what ability there is to track the sort of, I guess, soft outcomes of people, not just, was this person able to buy a new, I don't know, oven component that lets them make food at home, but like, were they able to feel better in their daily life or improve depression and anxiety? But before I move on, I'm wondering, Mayor, how you landed on the cap of the monthly total of $300 to $600, and are there plans to raise the cap? I know that Compton is in LA County. It is not one of the least expensive jurisdictions to live in the country. So I'm wondering how that number got picked.
And there's a body of work across the nation and otherwise that have tested various levels of direct assistance. And so our team decided on $300 to $600 as a sliding scale to be able to provide additional income to families with children. And so we're really testing how the different levels make a direct impact. But Emily, you also referenced just the intuitive measure of how people are feeling. And we actually designed our pilot to study well-being as an indicator for guaranteed income being effective for families. So we're studying how people feel. Are they more hopeful? Are they able to make different decisions? Do they have a longer term perspective on, or outlook on their lives? And then also we're measuring how their financial literacy is able to improve as well by having direct access to our benefits portal and other resources and information from our partners.
Wait, that's super interesting. So I'm going to take a pause before we delve into data. What is the financial literacy component of your benefits portal? I know this sounds really geeky, but it's a big issue, right? Like, I remember I had to learn in 7th grade home ec how to balance a checkbook. That skill is not super relevant because checkbooks don't really exist anymore. But can you talk about how this is used as an educational tool?
Sure. Well, first of all, the Fund for Guaranteed Income just are pioneers and created a customized portal that did not exist before to be able to not only provide direct access to our participants for their cash payments, but they're also able to access a benefits portal with a variety of partners that will provide financial literacy training. They have direct access to free checking accounts and other tools through other partners. And so we are continuing to roll out various aspects of tools and benefits to our participants along the way, and then measuring how they're able to take advantage of those and what the impacts will be. And our kind of internal objective was to really reduce the reliance of our population and our community on predatory lending, and to shift them into more traditional ways of managing their finances.
Amazing. Nika, please weigh in. Please.
I would just add that we have incredible partners who are providing one-on-one virtual financial health coaching from Operation Hope as well as Lyft. And a part of this is driven by our agenda to not only provide people cash and then measure outcomes as if it was a study. The goal is not a really successful study, but the goal is dignity, and building that dignity requires also having those personal relationships to enable economic self-determination.
So I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is a real tension, right? When you're trying to do something good for people's lives, funders and governments are constantly asking you, like, but can you prove it works? What are your numbers? What are your outcomes? What are your metrics? What are your outputs? And I feel like that's such a tension, because oftentimes folks who are trying to do good things care about dignity, about people living a life that is full of possibility with an intact future and hope. But there is so much pressure to create a more quantitative picture of the result of a program like this, building the case for doing this everywhere. So I'm hoping, Nika, that you could talk with us just for a second about what your group is going to be doing over the next 2 years to gather empirical data, and what kind of data you are gathering, in addition to the sort of deeply moral outcomes you just mentioned.
I mean, the data to prove that unconditional cash transfers have positive development outcomes since the 1990s is there. We are not focusing on do people who are income poor, does cash alleviate poverty? The answer is going to be yes. We are taking as a basis that this is a future for more inclusive social welfare programs. So given that, how do we implement it? What are those unanswered questions in the policy agenda? This is the largest city-based guaranteed income initiative. It's 800 people, and it's really looking at the timing of the transfers, the size of the transfers, a whole host of as Mayor Brown was saying, psychosocial well-being outcomes. But on the other hand, I will add that changing the narrative is so important here, because we get asked all the time, is this sustainable? What does success look like? And at the end of the day, success looks like people not being evicted, people like Georgia not being evicted. Success looks like challenging the system that we have, where we have billionaires and trillionaires who are continuing to amass wealth during the pandemic, and we have people who are excluded from even the bare minimum stimulus checks.
So you mentioned Mayor Tubbs in Stockton and other cities. Nika, can you talk with us a second about what the data? I know there's data dating back to like the 90s, and yes, it is seemingly a very simple point that giving people cash alleviates income poverty. But I'm wondering if you could talk about what the current data on these new experiments has shown so far, and how you're planning to use what you learn in Compton.
Sure. So, I mean, a statistic that I find really strong is that looking at the Stockton Seed Initiative, 40% of where the money was spent was on groceries. People spend money on groceries, on rent, on food, and we're looking at a rental crisis across the whole state. And so we will further prove and define the case for the overall impact of guaranteed income. But what I think is unique about our initiative is that we are looking at new components of this as if it were to be a scaled policy, which I think the time has come for.
So speaking of the time coming and rooting this in the opinion of ordinary people and voters, Mayor Brown, I want to talk to you about a recent national poll that was done by Data for Progress and the lab here at the Appeal, which showed that 59% of likely voters support piloting guaranteed income programs that provide these monthly cash payments on an ongoing basis to people in need. And I'm wondering if that tracks with your experience. Have most of your voters been supportive? Have you encountered any vocal opposition? Can you take me through the reactions you've gotten from the public, maybe positive and negative?
I have received just overwhelmingly positive responses from residents. They were just overwhelmingly supportive of residents receiving direct guaranteed income. Even those that would not qualify, they were just happy that those that really needed the direct assistance were able to access this critical funding, because obviously what happens to one family intrinsically impacts another and ultimately the whole community. And so poverty, I think, is something that touches all of us, and we all pay the high cost of poverty in some way, whether or not it's increase in crime or other social issues, even the impact on our healthcare system and the way that people access care and care for their families. And so I've experienced really a positive response. I would say on the more national level, I've seen a direct shift during the pandemic, overwhelmingly, to people being more open to the concept of guaranteed income. I think before there were just many misnomers, and there was just a kind of a big distinction between universal income and then guaranteed income. But I think that there's such a greater and increasingly level of support for people that understand that direct cash payments to those in poverty ultimately have a very measurable and significant impact to the well-being and the fabric of our communities and families.
Mayor, I will tell you, in my past life as a public defender, I have represented hundreds of people who were charged with stealing things like baby formula, bread, deodorant, kind of like really, really low level basic necessities. And I think we all remember the Three Strikes pizza case in California, where someone got a life sentence for stealing a piece of pizza. And I'm wondering if you could talk for a second about how you expect this influx of income, 40% of which may be spent on groceries, to interplay with the role of policing and jails in your region.
Absolutely. Well, first, I think overwhelmingly the majority of Americans, and there's the data to prove this, are without a safety net. They do not have a savings in any way. And so when an emergency presents itself, that immediately puts people into an emergency response situation. And so narrowing down to communities like Compton, and we've seen just overwhelmingly young people being introduced to the criminal justice system for petty theft, petty crimes, and the same thing with adults, that people are literally being penalized for being poor. And so the data is already there that makes the case that we need to be able to provide a threshold, a poverty floor, so that we can stop penalizing people for responding to emergency situations. And when people are stealing, as you said, Emily, formula and food and diapers and basic necessities for their families, that is a huge indication that our society as a whole has missed the mark, and we failed a large group of people. And so, and especially in the wealthiest nation in the world, and there's just an overwhelmingly increase of wealth growing with the 1%. And so it makes zero sense from a human perspective why there are people literally without the basic necessities for their children and their families. And we have to do better, and we can with guaranteed income.
Certainly co-sign that in the richest nation in the world, nobody should be stealing milk and Pampers. So Nika, I'd love to talk about the future of the Fund for Guaranteed Income for a second. And I'd also love to talk about the role of of sustainability and scalability in this guaranteed income movement more broadly. I think a lot of people are probably wondering, like, at what point did the taxpayers take over? Is this always going to be a philanthropic initiative? I'm hoping you could sort of set forth your vision for the future and any plans you have to expand to other cities.
Sure. I mean, as Mayor Brown was saying, guaranteed income cuts to the core of politics. Who gets what, when, and why? And we are living in the richest nation in the world. The initiative is called the Compton Pledge, about a pledge to building people's power, which is a take on the giving pledge of giving as charity. No, we should redistribute. And I love what Mayor Tubbs said earlier in the show today, that the country is almost in this process of waking up from what he called voodoo economics, that the wealth will trickle down, that the problem with welfare is the myth of the welfare queen. And so it's not to say that guaranteed income is a silver bullet solution, but it is to say that guaranteed income forms a part of this broader vision for community reinvestment that's holistic, and that we're co-designing with our partners like One Fair Wage, Black Lives Matter, Sherla, SE Justice Group, A New Way of Life. And I find that political coalition has some of my heroes in it that I really would trust to chart the future.
Charting the future is a beautiful image on which to land. Thank you both so much for joining us here. I wish you both the best of luck. Looking forward to circling back on how this goes and learning more. I hope to see you both back here in the future to tell us the brilliant and beautiful things you learned while charting the future.
Thanks for having us, Emily. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.
So I am sure that nobody needs to be reminded of the fact that we are in the middle of the worst pandemic in a century. And it's important to consider the idea that like guaranteed income, other innovations in the context of COVID-19. We tend to talk about these things as a response to a pandemic. And I think the pandemic has given rise to circumstances where a lot of cool new ideas can be tried out. In times of desperation, people get really creative. I think the expression is, well, something is the mother of invention, but we're certainly inventing a lot during this very, very difficult time. Necessity is the mother of invention. But we've got to remember that these problems aren't problems that go away during normal times. Like during normal times, millions of people are struggling to afford basic necessities like milk and Pampers, groceries, childcare, healthcare, access to insulin. So our social safety net is porous and inefficient at best. And the pandemic hasn't made it worse. It's just made it really obvious how bad it already was. Direct cash payments can help households cover their essential needs when times are tough. And in better times, they can give them a modest cash injection to help them start saving for the future, preparing for the next crisis, a moment of uncertainty, or even getting a little bit of economic mobility. As more and more cities begin to explore locally administered programs like the Compton Pledge, we're going to begin to find out how much can people really benefit when you just invest directly in the things that will bring stability to their lives. So very happy to have had a chance to talk with you all today about basic income. You can stay on top of the latest news here at The Appeal Live anytime you want. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.